dualities only hold when they are not deeply explored. So you can create a category like man versus woman, or man versus machine, or progress versus regress. And it might seem at first glance that, well, yeah, it's pretty, there's a pretty clear line, Leo, there's a pretty clear line between, for example, man versus machine. It's not hard to distinguish those two. But what I'm telling you is that, yes, it's not hard to distinguish those two, and usually it's not hard to distinguish a man from a woman, but there are edge cases that you're not taking into account. And also what's going to happen is that as we move forward into the future, you're going to see that these dualities start to bleed into each other more and more, to the point where maybe 500 or 1,000 years from now, it will be pretty hard to distinguish a man from a machine. Already we have human beings who have pacemakers, which are machine components embedded into the body, various kinds of implants, artificial hips and knees made out of titanium and other kinds of metals and new materials. And this is just going to keep happening more and more and more, to the point where, like, seriously, like in 500 years, society culturally is going to have a problem distinguishing a man from a machine. And then, questions will arise, of course, as they do in science fiction movies about, do machines deserve human rights, the same rights that a man has, that a woman has? Or do machines have a different set of rights? Is it, for example, is it ethical and moral to force a machine to work 20 hours a day in a factory without any rest or relaxation? Is that ethical? Well, right now, it's not a problem, because it's easy to distinguish man from machine, but it's going to get harder and harder and harder. Another example is, like I cited, progress versus regress. A lot of people, especially progressive people, liberals, they tend to have a very simplistic, dualistic notion of progress versus regress. And so they see the conservatives as being the ones who are regressing society, and then the progressives or the liberals, they're the ones who are progressing or advancing society. And generally, we tend to look at the world and we see, well, that case right there is either a case of progress or regress. But it's not so simple, because what you're not taking into account is how the two play into each other. In a certain kind of liberal progressive fantasy, you might imagine that, well, wouldn't it be great if there were no conservatives and all we had was just pure progress all the time? We're always hitting the accelerator with no brake. This is a dualistic delusion and fantasy. It can't be that way, because reality always has complementary and opposite forces that are at play with each other. And oftentimes what ends up happening is that in order for us to progress, we first need to regress. And you can notice that both collectively throughout history, in how societies and cultures and nations evolve, but you can also see it individually within yourself, in your own life. There are moments in your life where you're going to be progressing, and there are going to be moments in your life where you're going to be backsliding and regressing. And we tend to get, we tend to feel guilty when we're regressing in our lives, especially with personal development. If you're a self-help junkie, then you get guilty about this stuff. And you just have this, again, this kind of self-improvement fantasy of like, well, what if I could just be progressing all the time with no backsliding and no hiccups whatsoever? But again, that's a dualistic delusion. It can't be that way. And you need to understand that your progress comes about precisely oftentimes because of your regresses. So those moments when you're the most depressed, when you're backsliding the most, when you're cheating on your diet, when you're cheating on your plans, and you're failing to fall through on your goals, it's your failure, which then ultimately leads you to your next great success. But most people think way too dualistically, too simplistically, too much black and white, to see these dialectical interplays that happen between these opposing forces. And also, of course, you have to recognize that these categories of like man versus machine, progress versus regress, these are not just found in the world as if they're just kind of floating around in the universe somewhere. These are things that your own mind is creating. Your own mind is defining what is a man and what is a machine. And so, of course, you should expect that the categories that your mind comes up with, they're not going to be able to be true to ultimate reality. They're not going to be absolute. None of your categories are going to be absolute. Same thing with progress or regress. Nothing in the universe, there's no like book in the universe that's floating around in space that you can go and you can look up and see, okay, here's a list of what qualifies as progress. And here's a list of stuff that qualifies as regress. No, we're determining what progress and regress are. And so a lot of what politics is about is it's a battle about how to define various terms, whether it's man versus machine or progress or regress or man versus woman or anything else like that. So what I'm telling you here, we're still talking about this one corollary of this law of epistemology, that all dualities collapse. So the corollary is that if you deeply explore any duality to its ultimate root, what you will discover is that as you get further and further away to the edges of this duality, is you will see it collapse and bleed, and the edges will come back and circle back around and embrace each other in a unity. And you will realize that the entire time the two were defined in terms of one another. Because fundamentally what you're doing is you're using your mind to place boundaries within reality. And so you're carving up reality, but then who is carving up reality? Well, you carve it up one way, your neighbor carves it up another way, I carve it up another way, and then we all disagree because we've carved it up in different ways. And then who gets to say which way of carving it up is the best way? Well, of course, that depends on your goals. That depends on your survival agenda. That depends on what your ego needs. But we don't admit of that. Usually what we say is we just say, well, no, my duality is just the way that reality is. It's not something that I created. It's not something relative. It's how it actually is. And my way is the right way. It has nothing to do with me. This problem of drawing lines within reality is really tricky. It's notoriously tricky. In philosophy, this is known as the heap problem. How do you define what a heap is? So if you take a couple of grains of sand and you put them together, does that constitute a heap or just a few grains of sand? Well, you might say it's just a few grains of sand. Okay, but then if we take 1,000,000 of them, 1,000,000 grains of sand, put them together, would that be a heap? You'd say, yeah, it's probably a heap. Okay, but where do you draw the line between a few grains of sand and a heap? Is it 10 grains, 100 grains, 1,000 grains? Who gets to say? If I say it's 100 and you say it's 1,000, which one of us is right? See? But this goes way beyond just grains of sand. It's much more significant.